Hey everyone, welcome to the Security Observability Summit breakout session with me, Craig Goodwin. I'm going to be talking about seeing is believing, building a demonstrable security program with observability in mind. What I'm going to aim to do is bring you some of the end user CISO perspective to the conversation. I want to aim to tell you some stories about how I've used observability in the past and now to help me to build successful security functions, global security functions for technology businesses. So without further ado, second title slide, because it's incredibly important to have two of those. Firstly, a little bit about me. So my name's Craig Goodwin. I'm currently co-founder of Cybertar, a cybersecurity as a service business. Prior to that, I've spent 20 years in the industry as a chief information security officer or chief security officer for a multitude of different organizations globally and in different sectors as well. So my last role, working backwards, was chief trust and risk officer for Fujitsu, where I focused on the security of the delivery organization. Prior to that, global CISO for a number of large US tech companies, Ferguson Group, PLC, previously Wolseley Group, a large retail business and group of businesses. Monster Worldwide out of Boston, where I built the global security function there. And just before joining Fujitsu for 4 years, I built and ran the global security function at CDK Global, which is a large automotive technology business. Lots of observability within that security program. So we'll certainly be touching on that as we move through the presentation. If there are questions, by the way, as we go through the presentation, please feel free to save them to the end. We have got the Q&A functionality open on Zoom. So I'll be using that at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that you may have had, and I'll select those from that Q&A panel. So please make sure you throw them into that box, and I'll do my best to answer them and give you some perspectives at the end. Aside from being a CISO for 20 years, I've done many other things in the industry, sat on a number of advisory boards for vendor organizations, for alliances and industry focused groups, and VC firms as well. But mainly I've spent my time leading global product and security portfolio offerings for many large technology businesses. So let's dive right in. As I said, I want to make sure that I give you the end user CISO perspective as we move through this presentation, and feel free to pick me up on any of the points I make, ask questions, throw them in the Q&A, and I'm happy to build on them or answer any of those questions as we move through. The first thing I thought it was important to focus on is the difference between visibility and observability, and really what does observability mean as a chief security officer, as a security end user, as you try to build a security program. And what I think about when I think about visibility versus observability is a number of different things. Firstly, visibility for me is kind of a one-track trick pony. You know, it's about looking at things. It's about seeing what is happening. Whereas observability is much more about over time. It's much more about taking your metrics, digging deeper into what's happening, whether it be within applications like with Contrast, or whether it be within networks or other parts of your security program, and really digging into those logs, those metrics, to understand through the data what is happening within that product, within that application, within your networks and within your systems. So it's looking in, it's observing, and it's understanding what is going on. So if you take an analogy, I would use the analogy of physical security, for example. So if you were to take visibility, within a physical security context. You might talk about seeing an alarm go off, you know, getting an alert, getting an audible alarm that told you that someone had broken into your premises. Now that's all well and good, but you know nothing about the activity that occurred while that person was in the premises. Now, if you think about observability, observability would be much more akin to a CCTV system, right? So the ability to not only know that someone was attempting or successfully breaking into those physical premises, but also to observe what they're doing while they're there. Understand what rooms they went to, what they accessed, perhaps how they accessed it, what techniques they used to get in, what they did while they were there, and how the environment reacted to what they were doing. What they took, what they did with it, the list can go on and on. So for me, observability is much richer than visibility. It's much more about understanding how something behaves, why it behaves like that, and the context with which it behaves. Then finally, if we think about the second quote there from Ben, you know, what matters is what we do with it, not the data itself. So actually observability for me, and this isn't by any means the dictionary definition, but is about what does that data mean? And we'll come on to a bit further in the presentation about adding business context to that stuff. But with observability and generally building a security program, but even more so with observability, business context and why and how that particular behavior is operating just becomes increasingly more important and more unique depending on the business that you're building the security program for. Moving on then, so talking about why as a CISO, I'd want to focus on observability first. You'll see there's a little subtitle there, you know, why is it more than just a marketing buzzword? For those of you who have seen me on other webinars, you know, I do tend to rail a little bit against the marketing industry or against the vendor industry in security for creating a lot of buzzwords. And I think a lot of the trends within security are often instigated or promulgated by vendors, by product companies wanting to sell their particular wares. But with observability, and you can call it observability, you can call it a number of different things, I really do believe that it's more than that. And the reason I say that is because prior to the word, prior to it being, the next big thing in security, whether I called it that or not, I was already driving security programs with observability at the heart. And this is why. Firstly, the credibility of you as a security end user, as a CISO, as a CSO, is absolutely critical in making your security program successful. When you first come into an organization, or even when you've been there for a while, building credibility, building trust from the rest of the organization is got to be number one on your list. And the reason I mention that here is because observability really helps you to do that. Because with observability, you're able to understand the business that you're working with. You're able to make better decisions. You're able to build that credibility by talking to the business in a language that they understand. So to give you a couple of examples, gaining observability into particular business applications within a software company becomes absolutely paramount to talking to the R&D organization on a level that they understand. Previously in the past, I've taken a massive hit to my credibility by trying to dive in and get quick wins on my first days or months in the organization without really understanding what it is that I wanted to achieve or really understanding the business context of the organization. And by focusing on observability, you really do buy yourself that time. You say to the business, I heard a great story this week from a fellow CISO who told me that the first thing he said to his CEO when he joined the organization was that you're going to think I'm a terrible hire for the first 6 months. You're going to think that I'm doing absolutely nothing. And the reason you're going to think I'm doing absolutely nothing is because I'm taking the time to understand the business. I'm taking the time to understand the context within which the business operates. And that will enable me over time to really make the right decisions, to not dive in and try and impress you on day one, but to observe what is going on, both from a technical perspective and a business perspective, and therefore give myself the time to make credible decisions and build trust within the business. What that ultimately then leads to is the ability to then fix real business impacting issues. Not just take the first critical that lands on your desk because one of your tools or products has told you it's critical, but actually observe the behavior within the applications to understand whether it's important or not. And build your knowledge to enable by design for the future, right? When you understand the way that a product operates, an application operates, or a business operates, you can start to really build in from the outset ways of building security by design. If you don't understand that fundamentally and you start from a position of blocking or tackling or preventing the business to do what it needs to do, well, you're ultimately going to be onto a loser from the beginning. So building your knowledge of the business, building your knowledge of technology with observability will really allow you to understand the way things are working, the context, and start to design things that will lead to a better future for the organization. I'll give you one real world example. I was working in an organization where we had a particular application that was running within the environment. And through observability, we were able to see that an ex-employee of one of our customer companies had managed to build his own website to query the back end of this application. This would have been completely unbeknownst to us did we not understand how the application was working. And this wasn't because it was a critical vulnerability. This wasn't because, you know, a tool was telling me that it was important. I understood the way, or my team, I won't take the full credit for it, my team understood through observability the way that application should behave. And the reason we identified the fact that someone was behaving in a nefarious way, and in fact what we identified was that the database was being queried 20 or 30 times a second, we were able to understand through that behavior that that should have been a human or a person on the end of that application doing that work, and couldn't possibly have done it 20 or 30 times a second from a query perspective. We understood the context of that application, we understood the way it was operating, and therefore we were able to identify that as a particular issue. And actually, it was a significantly business impacting issue. We were losing revenue, we were losing potential sales via that mechanism. And therefore we identified it and able to stop it. Without observability and without context, we would never have known that was occurring, and certainly not with just logs or metrics alone. I mentioned it a couple of times already, so for those of you who don't realize, I'm incredibly passionate about this. We have to add business context. And the reason I'm stepping through these in the way I am is because, you know, we understand why we want to use observability. Now we understand how we use observability. And we use it in a way that adds business context to everything that we do. Too many CISOs, in my opinion, refuse to look at the business indicators and the business risks and the business context within which they're operating. For those who know me, or for those that have been in my teams in the past, will know that I constantly bang on about getting to know the business. And ultimately what the business is about making money. So let's take, for example, the application again, seeing as we're in the Contrast Observability Summit. Let's take the example of an application. If you're using just visibility to see vulnerabilities within application, it's very easy to presume that a critical means a critical, right? It's very easy to presume that you're seeing a critical vulnerability on a particular list of 1,000 vulnerabilities, and that should be the thing that you go after. Now add business context into that, and you might actually find that that critical vulnerability exists within a non-public facing application, for example, or exists within an application that is incredibly low on the totem pole from a revenue perspective for your business. Now that doesn't make it not important, But back to my first slide about credibility, if you go all guns and blazing after that one particular critical vulnerability without any business context, but then later, you know, day, weeks, months later, find that actually there's something much more important that you should be focusing on because it's in the application that generates perhaps 80 or 90% of your revenue for the organization, not speaking from experience here. But what you might find is actually your credibility is damaged to such an extent that you don't have the ability to change that now. You know, you don't have the ability to right the ship, move it, change direction, and actually focus on the things that really are important. So you've got to spend that time as part of this observability program, really understanding the context within which you're operating. If you're a software business, you know, and I've worked in many, do the simple things like take a list of your applications, work with the product owners to understand the revenue generation in that particular application, understand the number of users, understand whether it's a public facing or an internal application, understand how your customers use that, become a product manager, become a learner for that first period within the organization, or even start now, right? And really start to understand the business context within what you're operating. When we talk in a minute about the 3 key pillars of observability, that has to be number 1. You know, without that, you losing the battle. And the business, you know, many people, CISOs and, you know, other parts of the business alike constantly talk about this concept of the business. But it doesn't mean just the people, you know, it means the technology. It means everyone that operates in that entity to make it work. It means the culture. You know, do you have a culture where research and development are the key and the heart of your business? They're the power of the business. You need to understand where that power sits within your organization, and you need to understand how the culture operates to be effective as a CISO. And observability, not just in a technical sense, but in an organizational sense, can really help you to do that. One example, I spent months and months and months trying to influence the development organization within a previous company to change the way they did things, to change the way that they built their applications and make them more secure. And I didn't understand why I was failing. I could not understand why telling the developers how to do what they were doing, giving them the tools, giving them the resources, giving them the money just was not working. And it took me months to understand that actually the seat of power within the organization or the seat of power within that application and product business wasn't the developers at all. It was the product owners. And if you think about the way applications are built, the product owners were driving the backlog. They were driving what needed to get focused on. They were driving the conversations about whether security was at play or not when we were building the applications and products. So actually I was focusing my time and efforts just on the wrong seat of power. I should have been focusing on influence the product owner community. I should have been focusing on telling them what was important so that then they could feed it to the developers, not the other way around. And then finally, you know, great quote, I love this one. You know, you won't see it if you don't understand what you're looking at. And that goes for security and it goes for the business and adding business context. If you don't understand what it is you're looking for, and this is where observability can be so important. If you don't understand what you're looking at or even what you're looking for, how can you possibly find it? If you don't expect to see, you know, one of the employees of the business querying a particular database query every 10 seconds, if you don't understand it in the context of that application, that's not important or that's not different from normal, how are you ever going to be able to call that out? Moving on, I'm going to jump through these relatively quickly because by no means want to go into the technical things here, but what I want to do is pull together a couple of things that I've just said. You know, why should you start with observability? And hopefully I gave you a couple of ideas about why I think it's particularly important to start with observability when building a security program. We talked about utilizing logs, traces, and metrics a little bit as we went through this. And if you look up, observability in security or observability generally, whether it's in cloud computing or anywhere else, these kind of three key main pillars come up: logs, traces, and metrics. And what's really important about these three is that they have to exist in parallel together. And this is what makes a real differentiation between that and visibility. You could have visibility into your logs. You could have visibility into the traces, and you can have visibility into your metrics. But combined, they give you the ability to genuinely observe. So logs on the left-hand side, right? We all know logs. We all love centralizing logs. Not many people do it particularly well. We're all aware of SIM technology and how we potentially bring those things together into having a competent set of logs. But if you think about these three things as kind of the building blocks for building a security program around observability, you have to, unfortunately, address that technical complexity. You have to build a basis of data in order that you can start to observe what is happening within the organization. So it's not that logs aren't important, it's just that that has to be the fundamental building blocks, and it forms one part of the components. When we talk about traces, we then talk about deeper observability. So where is that data going? How does it move throughout your organization? And if we're particularly talking about applications or products, how do users interact with that data? How do they flow through the product? One of the perennial challenges with things like penetration testing, for example, is understanding the context of that application and how it works, how that data flows through. Many organizations are trying to help you to map threat flows within a product, map data flows. Often many businesses, newer ones aside, certainly the enterprise organizations that I've worked with a multitude of different technologies. So the ability for one technology product to really be able to do that full tracing of your applications is pretty limited. So bear that in mind as you're looking through it. If you have to utilize internal technology, utilize internal knowledge from development and product to help you to build those data flows and really understand how people are using the products, it can really take time. Behemoths of products that have been within your organization for 30 plus years, like I've had in the past, can be incredibly difficult to map. But lean on organizational knowledge, lean on technology tools, and start to build a picture of how those applications operate. And then finally, a favorite one of mine, and certainly a favorite one in the industry, is metrics. If you don't know, to that quote before, what you're looking for, how can you possibly understand what's important? So you need to start to build metrics, not just at an organizational level or a security organization level, or functional level, but also down to the metrics that you're looking at from a technology perspective. So you combine the logs, you combine those traces to see what's occurring within the product, and then you build metrics to be able to understand when something is above normal, below normal, or out of the ordinary. And that then really allows you to observe end to end, all the way through logs, through what is happening within that application, and then the metrics allow you to benchmark that to really build an observability picture across applications, across networking, wherever it is. So these are the three components. I think if you want to start on the journey to observability and driving a program with observability, these are the three key components that you really need to begin with. And then you bring all that stuff together. So we talked about the technology, we've talked about the business context, we talked about the three components and the three building blocks. So this is all about then combining those things together. People, process, and technology. I don't know how many times you've got to say it in security, but you can't have one without the other. So you've got to focus your organization, your security organization, on what's important to the business. It's not the cool next technology tool. It's not necessarily, blocking and tackling. It's about what's important to the business, and you align the security function with that. Bring executives along. Observability, by the way, is a fantastic tool to help you to get executives on board. When you're presenting to a board of directors, if you're able to articulate back to them what you're seeing, able to articulate back to them the problem and show them that you understand the business, then they will come along for the ride. They'll get what you're trying to do and they'll trust in your judgment calls. Too many CISOs dive into that first board meeting and start outlining how much money they want to spend, rather than telling and leading with observability, telling them that I'm not going to achieve anything for the first 6 months. You'll think you've made a terrible hire. Give me some time to observe. Give me some time to understand what is happening, utilizing these tools, utilizing these metrics, and I'll tell you what's important. Be transparent and accountable. Observability, again, is great for that. Being open, being accountable for what you're trying to achieve, being accountable for the time it takes to build that good picture, being transparent about why you're doing it and what you're doing. Be transparent about the fact that you know little about the business and you want to learn and you want to understand. You'll be incredibly surprised how many people don't do that and therefore fail further down the line. Always be learning. Your one way is never, ever the right way. And learn from people who understand the organization. Build that program to observe their behaviors, observe what they're doing internally and externally, to build your program to complement that, not to stop them doing what they need to do. I wanted to finish off a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You'll notice on the side of the slide there, that's my co-founder, Corey White. The reason I like to have him in this presentation is because all the things on the right-hand side I've done multiple times, and Corey's the one that keeps me honest on this stuff so that I don't do it anymore, right? And one of the things I like to do when I've got a group of security people together is provide kind of my experience on what I've done in the past and how that's really not helped me. Whether it's observability, whether it's any way of building a security program, all these things really don't help. They're a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's really important that we learn these things as we go through the process, and we'll be more successful in the do. Number one is smirking. The amount of calls that I sit on, now being on the dark side as a vendor, and have that little kind of visceral gut reaction when someone tells me, no, we've got no idea where our assets are, or, I've done no security, or I haven't even started on my security journey. That little smirk that we do when we speak to the business and the business says, I don't do any antivirus, or I don't do any vulnerability scanning. That kind of I'm mightier than thou smirk that CISOs or security professionals often put on, we need to drop that. Right? That makes the person feel inferior. Just observe their behavior, right? Bringing it back to the theme. Observe how they react to that. That puts them off immediately. They shouldn't understand this. That's why we're there. So let's help to educate. Let's stop smirking and let's work with the business to do things right. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, leave it in the 90s, right? Businesses, boards, lots of organizations are terrified of the cyber threat already. We don't need to scare people into doing the right things, particularly in enterprise and larger organizations. We need to work with them to understand how we embed security effectively. Maybe start talking about how this can drive revenue, right? It's a bit of a cliche in the industry. I think I've done it successfully a couple of times. Find ways to drive business with security rather than just using FUD. And stop shirking the responsibility for real risk reduction. In my honest opinion, far too many CISOs stop at identifying the problems, right? Stop at pointing out what is wrong with the business, akin to a mechanic walking up to your car, telling you what's wrong with it, and then refusing to fix it. Or a doctor, perhaps, diagnosing you with some kind of condition, but then refusing to give you any medicine or refusing to prescribe you something that will help you to get through the pain. We shouldn't be doing that as security professionals anymore. We should understand what the business needs, what the business outcomes are, and work with the business to get all the way to remediation. Help them to get to the fix. Help them to understand what that fix looks like and focus as much of our time fixing the things, investing in fixing the things and getting to the outcome as much as we do pointing out the problems and telling people how badly they're doing. So I think we're right up against time there. I've got about 1 minute left. So I will jump through the final slides here. As I said, I've been Craig Goodwin, co-founder of Cybertar. All my details are in the slides there. Happy for you to get in touch, either now through Q&A, which I see some are popping up, or afterwards. I'm always available and happy to speak to people about observability or anything in security. So please feel free to reach out. And with that, I will open up to Q&A. After the Q&A, as you can see on the slide, please head back to the SOS page. Remember to text to win one of the great prizes that I've seen. Unfortunately, I think I'm not allowed to win any of that stuff because I'm speaking, but I'm sure Contrast will send me something nice, and definitely a t-shirt. So make sure you request your attendee t-shirt. The link to the SOS page is in the Zoom chat, or will be in a second, and in your calendar as well. There we go, perfect timing for my alarm. Great, so let me just have a quick drink, because otherwise I'm going to run out of the ability to speak. And then we'll dive straight into some of these questions here. So Sahila kindly has just put the link back in the chat there, so please use that after the Q&A. So just running through these questions quickly then. Number one at the top here, where would you start with gathering the content around your business to help feed your security program? One of my favorite bit of advice there, I think, I won't take the credit for this, I definitely read it somewhere, was the first thing any chief security officer should do when joining an organization is put a load of money on your Starbucks card. Start to take people out for coffee, start to understand your peers, start to really understand the business, start speaking to people. There's always people that have been there a long time, and it's always really important to understand what the business is doing. Another thing I would say is understand what you're selling, right? Too many security people dive straight into the IT function, dive straight into the technology function, but try and understand what your business is doing. For example, back in the days when I was working for Ferguson PLC, that was essentially a collection of plumbing and heating retail brands. So, to dive into how a particular application worked that enabled the business was probably the wrong thing to do. Actually, what I did was, in fact, I didn't do this, what I should have done was dive into understand the retail business, understand where the money was coming from, what the shops were doing, what the front end of that operation was doing, to learn about the business, and then work your way back into the back office functions. Understand the business, start to build that context around the organization. Where would you start with building a strong set of security metrics? Again, I think it depends which business you're working with. I would start with what you want the outcome to be there. So one of the things that I've always done is garner feedback from the senior leadership team or from the board, depending where you're reporting, on what the key outputs they want to see. What are the key measurements? What are the key things that matter to them as an executive audience? And then you work your way backwards from there. So I give you a real world example. I built a metrics program around 170 or so different applications or products that we had within a software business that I was running the security function for. What I did was start with my endpoint. So I started with a dashboard that showed every one of those applications all linked by risk. And I was able to start from the end. And even, you ask any of the guys that worked for me back then in the team, and they would say, well, Craig's built this completely useless dashboard that doesn't show anything, doesn't reflect reality, doesn't show what we're trying to do as a security function. And at the time, they were absolutely right. But what I'd done is to find my endpoint, to find my outcome first. So what I could then do is work backwards from there and build the metrics that would allow me to feed that dashboard that I was going to show the board. And I stepped back from that and started to build up, well, if I need to get the overall risk score for an application, what are the components that would build that out? That might be the application score, the infrastructure score, the disaster recovery score, for example. And then I stepped back from there and said, okay, so what are the tools, therefore, that are going to give me the observability and the metrics to build that score. And I won't go on, but you get the point. You work back through that from your end goal in mind to really get to a point where you're starting to build up those back-end metrics for your team, for the wider organization. One final thing on metrics I think is really important. Don't just focus on security metrics. So a lot of CISOs will focus on purely the metrics or the things that they want their security team to do. Security, as we all know, is everyone's responsibility. So think about building metrics for other parts of the organization. For me, in that particular business, that was the product owners, right? Build the metrics as you move into the annual planning cycle. Build the metrics you want them to achieve. Build that into the chief product officer's roadmap. Help him to understand what you need his organization to achieve, and flow them across much wider than just the security organization. Let's jump through a couple here. Easy one at the bottom, I'll do that one first. Where to request for the complimentary t-shirt? I think if you follow the link that Sahila's put in the chat, then you'll find the link there to put in your details and get your t-shirt. Obviously, the most important thing of any security summit, regardless of whether it's virtual or physical. Is observability a specific budget, or should it be included in your SIM budget? Good question, a bit more technical. I think observability itself is a concept, right? So actually, it doesn't sit within one particular component. I think first thing to mention is good on you for having a specific security budget. We laugh, but that's still not it's still not as common as we would all like it to be. But secondly, I think observability is a concept across all of your across all of the things you do as an organization, as a security function. So I wouldn't have it as a specific budget item. I think what I would do is utilize it as a concept across those other areas. So for example, if we're talking about product security or application security within an organization, I would have an item that allowed you to build the logs, that allowed you to build the metrics, that allowed you to build the traces, and whatever security technology, people and processes fit into that bucket, I would sit that within your product security function. Now, it might really help because a lot of executives understand the concept of observability or getting more up on the concept of observability. Perhaps have that conversation with the board. Tell them what part of that product security budget is about learning, is about observability, leading you to get to the outcomes. That's the planning part, and that's incredibly important to build that trust and credibility for what you spend money on further down the line. I think that's all the questions we've got in the chat. I'll hold on for one more minute. I think we've probably got 2 minutes left here. So we're hitting time perfectly. If there are any other quick questions, then do let me know. Otherwise, like I said, contact details are in the slides. Feel free to reach out to me. Happy to ask questions afterwards or have conversations with people afterwards. Remember to head back to the SOS page. Do your text to win, request your free t-shirt. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Thanks for Contrast for laying this on. And I look forward to speaking to you all again soon. The recordings and the presentations will all go out tomorrow, I'm reliably informed, so you'll have my contact details there. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for taking the time, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.